What is up? Welcome into yet another edition of Benstant Reaction, spinoff of the Ben Garcia Show, where we react to a game, a trade, something big happening in the sports world, or maybe it's just a big game or a primetime game like the one we had last night as the Philadelphia Eagles defeat the Washington Commanders 26-18, taking a commanding lead in the NFC East. And I have thoughts on both teams, not just the winning team or the losing team, this time on the Ben Garcia Show. So let's start off with the winning team. Let's start off with the Philadelphia Eagles winning this game 26-18. I don't think my thoughts are going to be super original because they haven't wavered with the Eagles. Now, after Nick Sirianni was fighting with the crowd after barely beating the Browns after a bye week, I had said I would have fired him on the spot, and I still don't change from that opinion. I think Nick Sirianni is a buffoon of a head coach, and I thought it was such a bad look. It would ultimately derail their season so much so that I didn't even think they would make the playoffs. That clearly is not the case because this team's talent is just otherworldly. I do think Jalen Hurts isn't necessarily playing particularly up to what you would like him to, but granted, last night he wasn't asked to do as much as maybe you would like to see your franchise quarterback do. It was the Saquon Barkley show. It was a lot of the skill position players show. And it is not just enough of what the Philadelphia Eagles last night. It's also what the Washington Commanders didn't do last night. But we'll get to them in just a second. The Philadelphia Eagles have potentially the most talented roster in the NFL. But here's why I don't consider them a legitimate Super Bowl contender. So much of this league is about coaching. I still wonder about their culture, and all of that is set from the head coach, Nick Sirianni. I don't necessarily love their offensive coordinator either, and Kellen Moore. I think a lot of it is just leaning on Saquon Barkley. This team is incredibly talented. They are uberly talented. A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, Jalen Hurts, elite offensive line, Saquon Barkley, Dallas Goedert. They've got guys everywhere. But I think when it comes to a legitimate matchup with a legitimate team who also has similar or the same amount of talent, they will get outcoached 100 out of 100 times. Nick Sirianni is going to be the thorn of the side of this team. Thorn in the side of this team, I guess I should say. He is not to the level of other head coaches that will propel him further in the playoffs. I don't think I'm alone in this aspect. I think he is oftentimes very childish. I think oftentimes he lacks maturity. And I don't think his players actually like him that much. I think this is more so rally around the talent that they have, not so much so the coaching staff. And so, with the Philadelphia Eagles, although it looks like they're going to win this division pretty handily, and although they've got a ton of talent, if they go up against a Detroit or even a Green Bay Packers or a Washington Commanders potentially again, maybe on a different site, different time of year, maybe not so much the Commanders, but a Falcons maybe even. If they go up against one of the best teams in the NFC, who have roughly the same amount of talent as them, they are going to get outcoached 100 out of 100 times. Nick Sirianni doesn't possess the leadership or the maturity or a standard that he would hold everyone to on this team for me to just put everything away and believe that this team can win a Super Bowl, that can be a legitimate Super Bowl contender. If they even had an average head coach, I would move them into the Super Bowl favorites category. But because I believe he's hindering the development of Jalen Hurts, and because I don't think the team necessarily rallies around him, I think they are more so rallying around the talent, and because of his lack of maturity, and because of his lack of leadership, I can't trust this team. And that is ultimately what it comes down to. In the playoffs, when it's cold, and when the opposing team is taking away your best weapon, what does your head coach do to figure that out and come up with a different game plan to win that game? And I think if you're ranking all the head coaches in the playoff picture right now, Nick Sirianni would easily be my least favorite head coach. And I don't think the team buys into him either. And I think ultimately this could be the worst positioning that the Eagles could be in. If the Eagles had an okay season and they just barely made the playoffs and they lose in the first round, which I think can still happen, that latter part of what I just said, losing in the first round, then you get rid of your head coach. And you can potentially go get someone else, and it is a great job opening. Now, if you get further into the playoffs and the talent takes you oh so far, there's a potential you keep that head coach. And then you just run it back next season, having to deal with the elephant in the room that is Nick Sirianni. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the only thing that is separating this team from being a legitimate Super Bowl contender is coaching. I don't necessarily love the offensive coordinator. I think it is too Saquon Barkley dependent. I think Nick Sirianni is hindering the development or the further development of Jalen Hurts, the maturity, the lack of leadership, and just the any second at any time he can implode on the sidelines and start going after fans and then hide from it by bringing his kid up to the podium after the game. I just can't trust them. And that is ultimately what it comes down to in the playoffs. How much do I trust you? And Nick Sirianni, I don't trust him at all. I trust the talent. I trust Jalen Hurts' maturity. I trust Saquon Barkley. At this point, the defense is starting to play better. I'm starting to trust them more. But there are going to be a lot of talented teams in the playoffs. And Nick Sirianni has to give the edge to this team to be able to go further in the playoffs. And I just don't trust him. If I was ranking all the head coaches right now that are in the playoff picture, Nick Sirianni would easily be in last place. And that is not a place you want to be if you're a team trying to go further in the playoffs than you did the year prior. So I think ultimately it's still going to end in disaster for the Philadelphia Eagles in the playoffs, and I wouldn't pick them to win a singular playoff game. However, I was wrong at this point. They will be a playoff team, barring a massive setback. Now, let's talk about the other team that lost this game last night. The Washington Commanders. Now, there's starting to be a little bit of regression to the Washington Commanders, and I don't think it's fair to everyone outside of one particular player. So we just talked about the head coach of Nick Sirianni of the Philadelphia Eagles. So now let's talk about some of the coaching issues on the opposing side of the ladder. You know, we talked about earlier in the season, I was just early to the party. Being someone that had covered the Arizona Cardinals for a while I was still at Fox Sports 910, and someone that still covers them now, but for this YouTube channel. I had mentioned at the beginning of the year, Cliff Kingsbury is the OC of this team. I am not buying into Jaden Daniels. I am not buying into Dan Quinn. I am not buying in to some of the weapons of this team. I am not buying in to Cliff Kingsbury and the offense of this team. Now, I was just early to this train, and I was wrong at first, but I had to wait a few weeks. This team is now a Hail Mary away from being 1-3. This Washington Commanders team is eerily similar to the 2020 Arizona Cardinals. Started off really high, got off to a really good start, and coming off of a Hail Mary win against the Buffalo Bills at home. Very similar to the Washington Commanders' Hail Mary win against the Chicago Bears, propelling them to their 6th win of the season. And then they completely fall off a cliff. And Cliff Kingsbury's offense is starting to look eerily similar to what it did in the second half of seasons with the Arizona Cardinals. Oftentimes, Cliff Kingsbury's biggest point of weakness that media members and people like myself often criticize was his inability to throw the ball downfield late in seasons. Well, at this point, Jaden Daniels had 32 pass attempts last night, and 24 of them were within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage. That is what Cliff Kingsbury's offense is in the second half of seasons. It gets way too conservative, and he has an inability to adjust that Cardinals fans have been warning Commanders fans for years. This is not an indictment on Jaden Daniels. Clearly, I was wrong about him, and he has a very bright future in the NFL. But just look at some of these statistics for Cliff Kingsbury as a head coach of his teams. In 2021, the Cardinals started off 7-0. He finished that season 3-5. 2020, started that season off 5-2, finished that season off 3-6. 2019, 3-1, finished that season off at 2-7. Games numbers 1 through 7, Cliff Kingsbury was 42, 20, and 1. The rest of the years, 16 for 43. And that statistic is from 2013 as a Texas Tech head coach all the way to 2021 with the Arizona Cardinals head coaches. And that has been the story of Cliff Kingsbury. And that is what we have so far with him as being the leader of this team. So this isn't an indictment on Jaden Daniels. This isn't an indictment on Terry McLaurin. This isn't an indictment on this team. This is strictly an indictment on Cliff Kingsbury. And it is starting to now follow him into what is an OC position with the Washington Commanders. And now are a Hail Mary away from being 1-3 in the second half of this season. This team is going to fall apart because of Cliff Kingsbury. It is not going to fall apart because of Jaden Daniels. We have years of data, 2013 to 2021, from being the head coach of Texas Tech to being the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. His team falls off a cliff. And that is, I guess, no pun of its own, but this team, that is my worry. It's not Jaden Daniels. It's not the offensive pieces. It's not the defensive pieces. It's not Dan Quinn. It's the fact that the Commanders hitch themselves to a head coach or an offensive coordinator that consistently falls off a cliff year in and year out. And that's where I'm at with the Washington Commanders. I was just early to the party saying this team was going to fall apart because of Cliff Kingsbury, not because of Jaden Daniels. This is not an indictment on him. Do not make it seem like I'm going after Jaden Daniels. He is obviously a phenomenal quarterback with a bright future in the NFL. But I saw it before, and we are continuously seeing it now. Cliff Kingsbury is the issue with this Washington Commanders team, and it's going to follow him until he figures out how to adjust. And through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years as a head coach or an offensive coordinator, at this point, a decade, he still has not learned to adjust to defenses. And until he does, that's what the issue is going to be with this team.